Golden days are so far away, there's a black rain up above, out on the wind you hear her call, she's under your skin and you drift away. It was bleak. Not all traces of the war had yet been removed from Hogwarts, but the students had returned after the summer holidays and work had been postponed until the next holiday. Harry's eyes found every tiny trace of the war, in every corridor, on the grounds, in the Great Hall. Everything that was different from before caught his attention, and Harry shuddered each time, and in his head soundless screams and cries for help, spells and the sound of stone breaking formed. Until Hermione usually nudged him with her elbow at some point, probably noticing that his eyes had gone blank and were flickering restlessly, that he had lost focus and could no longer listen, let alone know what they were even talking about at lunch. It happened so often, and Harry was sure that Hermione had long since developed some kind of radar and was gently bringing him back to reality. What would he do without her? "This can't go on like this, Harry," she said urgently this time when he blinked and turned his attention back to her and the cauldron cake he had hopefully put on his plate, but he just wasn't hungry. "Perhaps you should accept Kingsley's offer. It will do you good to be away from Hogwarts for a while, where everything reminds you of the war." Kingsley had offered all members of the DA the opportunity to start or retraining at the Ministry, regardless of their previous school education. Not all Death Eaters were in Azkaban yet, and they could use all the help they could get, and Harry knew that they would welcome the Chosen One with more than open arms, but he had always believed that his place was at Hogwarts. He wanted to catch up on his newts and carry on living as normally as possible, but somehow normal life was much harder than he had expected. He remained silent and choked down a bite of kettle cake. He didn't want to leave Hogwarts because he would have to expose himself to the public, who were curious and celebrated him as a savior even more than ever before. He had survived the event at which they had awarded him the Order of Merlin First Class more or less. It was an irony of fate, he thought, that he had been summoned to the Malfoys' hearing the morning before the event. He had patiently answered the judge's questions and argued for Narcissa and Draco to be acquitted, and now all three were in Azkaban. That's how much the word of the savior of the wizarding world counted for, Harry thought grimly. But he had no strength left to fight for it and to become more vehement. Keep fighting for Malfoy, of all people? The fight against Voldemort had simply used up his strength. Later, he had cast a glance at him outside the courtroom and looked down just as quickly when cold grey eyes fixed on him mockingly. When he looked up again, Malfoy had already been led away, and Harry was surprised that he didn't feel miserable. He just didn't feel anything, and at first he had actually been relieved about it. "Or look, McGonagall has suggested that you captain the Quidditch team again. Ginny wouldn't mind if you..." "Hermione. You need a job, Harry. And I think it would do you good to do a bit of flying." Harry stood up. He was really grateful to Hermione, but sometimes he just couldn't stand her obvious concern. He blinked irritably at the ceiling of the Great Hall. It was October and it was raining non-stop, dark, heavy rain from black clouds, making his life seem even bleaker than it probably was. "See you later," he said, tearing his eyes away from the enchanted sky, reaching for his bag, feeling the eyes of at least 100 students on him as he began to cross the Great Hall. Behind him he heard Ron say, "I told you this was no use. Just leave him alone." But Harry stopped and walked faster. In front of the Great Hall he took a sure path. McGonagall had still not dared to enter Dumbledore's office. Perhaps her awe was too great, but Harry had never been a particularly awe-inspiring person, and he knew Dumbledore's last password. He told it to the gargoyle and stood on the spiral staircase, which immediately began to move. It was too slow for him, so he jumped up 2 steps at a time. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, closed it behind him and leaned against it. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said kindly, smiling at him from his portrait over half-moon glasses. Harry just nodded and Fawkes shrieked, "Is everything all right, Harry?" Harry shook his head. He didn't want to talk to Dumbledore because Dumbledore knew exactly what was wrong with him, so he just remained silent and caught a look from Dumbledore that looked somewhat regretful, and that made him angry. "Stop pitying me," he hissed, went to the cupboard next to Dumbledore's desk and pulled the door open. He reached for the pensieve and placed it on the desk in a routine manner. "Oh, but I don't pity you, Harry," Dumbledore said calmly, and Harry wished he would just disappear from his portrait like he sometimes did and leave Harry alone with the odd memory. "I care about you. That's a big difference." Harry snorted and pulled out his wand. He held it to his temple, thinking of his parents, missing them even more than he had before the war or during the war, remembering what he had seen in Snape's mind, and let a silver streak flow into the pensieve. Then he put the wand away and leaned over the swirling mess, in which Lily's blurred face was now visible. When he returned to Dumbledore's office the next day with a rickety stack of books in his arms, The headmaster raised his eyebrows in appreciation. "I see you've finally decided to put in the effort for your newts, how gra?" "No," said Harry brusquely, setting the books down on the desk, ignoring the fact that he accidentally knocked over a fancy, finely crafted quill, and stood in front of Dumbledore's portrait with his arms folded. "How do you become an animagus?" Dumbledore's eyebrows rose, but he remained silent. Harry shrugged. "Hermione said I needed a task. So I looked for a task. Professor McGonagall is an animagus, as you know. Perhaps you should take your problem to her," Dumbledore said soberly, but Harry shook his head. "Professor McGonagall wouldn't understand. She wants me to study for my newts. I want that too." Harry narrowed his eyes. "No," he said, picking up a book, a really thick tome, and holding it in front of Dumbledore's portrait. "You will help me. Because I helped you." It was exhausting, and it was something Harry wasn't good at. It had to do with concentration and sometimes reminded him unpleasantly of the occlumency lessons with Snape. He didn't need a wand and at first he couldn't stand more than 5 minutes in the incredible silence of Dumbledore's office before he fled because memories of screams, spells and the sound of breaking rock overwhelmed him. But it got better. He spent hours in Dumbledore's office doing nothing. Sometimes he felt something like a pulling between his ribs, a gentle fluttering, as if something wanted to come out from inside, but most of the time it made him sick and he would curl up and immediately the feeling would disappear and Harry would open his eyes. Most of the time Dumbledore would say, "Well done, Harry," even though nothing had happened. Once Harry swore impatiently afterwards and pulled himself up. "How long does it take?" "Most people take years to become a real animagus." "What do you mean by real?" "Until they can transform at any time of their own accord." "But just because you do it once doesn't mean you can do it at will, Harry. It takes a lot of discipline and practice. My father learned it in a few weeks. And Sirius. Even Pettigrew, and that frustrated Harry the most." "You're on the right track," Dumbledore replied patiently, then looked at him over the half-moon glasses. "Besides, it would no doubt be a hassle to have to find a new task so soon, don't you think?" He pointed out something that Harry was deliberately pushing to the back of his mind. If he had done it, if he had become an animagus, then what? It was so horrible that Voldemort had obviously been his whole life, in an absurd, ironic way. Sometimes he dreamed of a dead Voldemort sneering at him for not being able to just live. But when he woke up, he didn't feel miserable, just empty. He didn't feel anything and that was frightening. He wondered if he had made the right decision when he had had the choice. Maybe the only purpose in his life had been to destroy Voldemort and there was simply nothing left in life for him. A scary thought and Harry had had enough of being afraid and so pushed it away. At least that was working better since he felt nothing and practiced concentration in Dumbledore's office. Great, Harry." His voice sounded strangely distorted, and when Harry opened his eyes he wanted to cry out in surprise, but it was a strange sound he made, more a screech than a scream, and Fawkes answered him with a soft sing-song. Harry's head jerked around and it took a while for his gaze to focus on the phoenix. He realized he had turned his head too quickly, faster than was normally possible. He looked down and saw nothing but black and long talons peeking out from under his shiny plumage. It was a crow. Hermione really was a clever witch, Harry thought as he flew over the grounds. She had been right. Flying did him good. He stretched his wings until they reached their full span, made a wide arc over the lake and sank a little lower over the water. He had quickly learned to let the wind carry him without much effort, and he had hardly had to practice flying off Dumbledore's window ledge either. Dumbledore had explained to him that his own animagus form was hardly influenceable. The emptied mind, the naked soul, sought out the right animal. At first Harry had been briefly disappointed because a crow seemed too unimposing to him and somehow evil, dark and deceitful. But in one of the books about animagi he had read that crows were above all tough, sociable, loyal and intelligent and he had quickly come to terms with that. The fact that he could fly was great. For the first time since Voldemort's fall, it was something he enjoyed without restrictions, and in a moment of high spirits he let himself sink lower over a group of second years and pulled a blonde girl's hair, shrieking instead of laughing. His trips beyond the Hogwarts grounds became more frequent, and again he had to think of Hermione. It was good not to be at Hogwarts. He flew for hours over forests, flew to the sea and back again, flew to London and was chased away by his fellow creatures and had a great time while he tried to communicate with them, but they couldn't make sense of his awkward croaking. Ron and Hermione soon became suspicious because he often returned to the castle late and missed many lessons, but he didn't care. Why did they still need defense against the dark arts, he wondered, when the Ministry had even locked up the Malfoys, Lucius for life, Draco and Narcissa for a year. "Harry, if you keep going like this, "You'll never get your newts," Hermione complained at breakfast, staring at him skeptically. "Where are you all the time? If you do anything stupid, it would be good if I knew, don't you think?" she asked pointedly as Harry stuffed himself with pumpkin pies. "Flying made you hungry." "It's okay, Hermione. Really." She opened her mouth to protest when they were interrupted by the post owls. Relieved at the distraction, Harry watched as an owl dropped the Daily Prophet on Hermione's buttered toast and she, wrinkling her nose, scooped it clean and opened it. "Oh my," she then whispered, leaning over the newspaper. Harry paid her no further attention. There was nothing that could scare him after the fall of Voldemort. It was as if he had already seen the worst. His gaze fell on Ginny, who was sitting next to Dean, unfolding a piece of parchment. He wondered where the burning jealousy had gone when he saw her sitting so close and familiar to Dean, and thought that it was unbelievable that Voldemort had taken everything from him in the end, not just the good feelings, but the bad ones too. He felt miserable when he remembered the war in the past, but there was nothing in the here and now that could make him feel miserable, and somehow he missed the feeling. He flinched when Hermione pushed the newspaper towards him. The first double page was a large, black and white photo. Harry saw only light hair flashing. Lucius Malfoy's hair had obviously become thin. He stood behind the bars of his cell door, a pale hand with long, thin fingers clenched around one of the bars, and looked into the camera with empty eyes. His face was haggard, his cheekbones clearly prominent. But the bones in his hand were prominent from the way he gripped the wand so tightly, testifying to whatever last spark of strength he might have had left. Harry shrugged listlessly, remembering that Lucius Malfoy was responsible for Ginny nearly dying in her first year at Hogwarts, and tried to push the paper towards Hermione. He deserved it. But Hermione protested, tapping the right side of the photo with her other hand, which Harry had barely noticed. He leaned over and looked more closely, trying to see between the bars of the second cell door, and saw another patch of light blonde hair. In the far corner of the cell, right up against the wall, crouched Draco Malfoy, his black cloak wrapped tightly around his body, his head on his knees, his face hidden. Harry frowned and grabbed his chest in surprise and only involuntarily. There was a strange feeling between his ribs, a heavy pressure that pulled inwards, as if it wanted to narrow his chest, squeeze it in. He blinked in surprise. He felt miserable. "She spreads her wings when she's gonna fly, the crow. If you make her sing when she's coming, she will let you know." Christmas was awful. Fred was everywhere, even though he wasn't there, because he wasn't there. Mrs. Weasley hadn't knitted any brightly colored jumpers and Harry had never thought before that he would miss them. George went off to his room early. Harry hadn't seen him for a long time. He didn't have much in common with the old George. He was gaunt, pale, with deep rings under his eyes and sometimes he would stare blankly and flicker into space and Harry wondered if that was exactly how he looked when he remembered. It made them all feel uneasy and some of the family breathed a sigh of relief quite obviously when George went to his room. Dead Lupin crowed once wearily and Andromeda Tonks rocked him on her lap so he wouldn't disturb the awkward silence any further. At the end, Ron said, "I'm going to quit school." "What?" Molly jumped and Ted whimpered again on Andromeda's lap. Harry was somewhat surprised when Ron said he had already discussed this with Hermione. He wanted to help George reopen Weasley's wizard wheezes. Molly paled as he spoke, and at the end she was wiping tears from the corners of her eyes and clutching one hand around the edge of the table. Ron walked over to her and kissed her cheek. "It's okay, Mom," he murmured, although everyone in the room could tell that nothing was okay. Ron made to follow George upstairs. But he turned around again and Harry caught a glance. Ron looked strange, a little uneasy and somewhat guilty. "Sorry, Harry. He's my brother." Harry didn't understand what he was apologizing for, but he nodded anyway and watched him disappear from the living room and climb the stairs. Andromeda stood up with Ted in her arms, but when he whined despite being tired, she carefully put him on his feet and gave him a hand because he couldn't walk without it yet. "We'll go too, Molly. He's dead tired." She put a hand on Ted's brown hair. Molly nodded and stood up. "It's nice that you're here. I thought Harry would be happy to see the little one, didn't you, my dear?" Harry caught a warm look, but he ignored it and stood up. "Andromeda," he said, the name tasting strange and awkward on his tongue. He had never spoken to her before. "Yes?" She looked a little awestruck and caught Ted with her other hand as he lost his balance. She placed him back on her hip. "Have you heard anything from Mrs. Malfoy?" Narcissa Malfoy was Andromeda's sister, after all. Harry felt the eyes of all the Weasleys on him and Andromeda's eyes flickered uneasily, no doubt nervous that he of all people was asking about the Malfoys. He explained, Mrs. Malfoy saved my life during the battle by lying to Voldemort. Andromeda's eyes widened. Harry didn't mention that was only part of the explanation. The other part was that he hadn't felt miserable since he'd seen the picture of Malfoy in his cell. Not even now, at Christmas, when Ted's face, his godson's face, looked up at him self-consciously, without any recognition in the brown, round eyes, because Harry had not yet made an effort for Ted to get to know him. Now he instinctively reached out a hand and touched his cheek. The skin was soft and warm and Ted let out a whimper and clung to Andromeda's neck. Harry let go of him and shoved his hands in his pockets. Andromeda ran a hand along Ted's back and shrugged uneasily. He doesn't know you yet. And sometimes they are strangers at that age. He's been through a lot, he's not that into people at the moment. She sounded apologetic, but Harry waved her off. It's okay. Have you heard from her? Mrs. Malfoy? Oh, said Andromeda, adjusting Ted on her hip. No. Since she went to Azkaban, there's obviously been no way to make contact. Harry nodded and turned away. What a stupid question, he thought, running his hand through his hair. There was no way to find out anything about the Malfoys. Unless he did it himself. He had really tried the right way. Hermione would be proud of him, Harry thought grimly as he read Kingsley's answer. He couldn't visit Azkaban, it just wasn't possible and too dangerous. You've been through a lot, Harry. The Dementors would sense that and use it mercilessly. The unsteady thought flickered briefly through Harry's mind that Malfoy was no different. The war had certainly not been a walk in the park for him either. And besides, he was a much bigger coward than Harry, which is why the Dementors were definitely after him. Harry tasted bitter bile and made a decision at that moment. He swore that when he had done his newts and went to the Ministry to become an Auror, he would make sure that the Dementors were abolished as guards of Azkaban once and for all. They were cruel creatures, they did not belong in a peaceful world, he thought. A new task, he thought suddenly, and paused and rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe there were other things for him to do after all. And maybe Draco Malfoy was one of them. 3 days after he returned to Hogwarts after Christmas, Harry was extremely surprised when he was called into McGonagall's office. Professor Pinniger, the new professor of potions, told him over lunch. Harry set off and knocked on the office door a short while later. Pleasant warmth greeted him and he murmured a greeting and stood undecided at the door. McGonagall was not alone. Mr. Potter, I hope you had a pleasant Christmas with the Weasleys? Not particularly pleasant, Harry answered absently, eyeing the dark-haired witch who was sitting in an armchair in front of McGonagall's desk and looking at him over her shoulder. He remembered her. Mrs. Jones? Hestia Jones was in the Order of the Phoenix. She had temporarily hidden the Dursleys in a safe place before Harry's 17th birthday. It's nice to see you again, Mr. Potter, she said benevolently, bowing her head deeply. Harry nodded and looked back and forth between the two of them. Is there a problem? Oh, no, said Mrs. Jones kindly, shaking her head. I'm here on business. I'm just supposed to get something. The Ministry, in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, has been looking for Mr. Draco Malfoy's wand for quite some time. Now the Minister has personally pointed out that you, she hesitated. Keep it? It sounded like a question and McGonagall continued, is that right, Potter? She sounded quite confused. I thought it was very unlikely that you of all people would have Malfoy's wand. Yes, I do, but I thought, he only has half a year left in Azkaban, I wanted to give it back to him myself. Hestia Jones smiled softly. Well, Mr. Potter, prisoners' wands are always kept at the Ministry. There's a very simple reason for that. She looked friendly and the thought flashed through Harry's mind that she would have made a pretty good teacher. Most wizards who return from Azkaban cannot, under any circumstances, take their wands back straight away. They are confused, many talk nonsense, others stop talking at all. Too many accidents could happen. Most of them spend at least a year after their time in Azkaban and St. Mungo's before they... You mean like in a mental institution? Harry blurted out, looking back and forth between two questioning faces. Excuse me, but I don't know what. You mean they're going mad, don't you? Harry asked more calmly, looking at McGonagall. I thought Malfoy could come back after the year and get his school-leaving certificate. That's what they said at the trial. Well, McGonagall began, but Hestia Jones interrupted her. In theory, that's perfectly correct, Mr. Potter. If, after a thorough examination by the Ministry, he is able to do so, but he never is, Harry snapped, rubbing his chest involuntarily as his insides clenched painfully. He was astonished to find that he felt miserable for not helping Malfoy and for not being more determined when he testified on his behalf. He had simply accepted the verdict, but he never really accepted anything, And suddenly he was surprised at himself. I mean, that's Malfoy, he's going to go mad. He looked at Professor McGonagall, but she didn't bat an eyelid. He looked back at Hestia Jones. She smiled. That makes it all the more important that you give us his wand so we can keep it safe for him. Who knows where you'll end up after school? She winked, as if she were having a perfectly normal conversation with a perfectly normal teenager starting a new life after school. Harry cursed and stormed out of the office. If they wanted Malfoy's wand, they would have to take it by force. The next morning, he received an owl. It was from Kingsley. Of course, you can keep Malfoy's wand. If at some point, after a thorough check, he is able to do magic again, he can just get a new one. I didn't know that was important to you. It sounded as if Harry wanted to keep it out of spite, precisely because it was Malfoy. As if that would be a satisfaction for him or a trophy from the war. Harry had to gag because it disgusted him so much. Lost in thought, he wandered through the corridor towards the astronomy tower just a few days later. Hermione was still on a skiing holiday with her parents, and Harry was amazed at how much. He wished she was here, just to distract him, to gently poke him in the ribs and admonish him when his gaze drifted off into memories. To give him some task, anything, just to stop him from getting any stupid ideas. But Hermione wasn't there, and so Harry continued on towards the astronomy tower. It was quiet and strangely bright in the castle because the sun was shining outside and there was meter-deep snow that shone in the light and gave off some of the light into the castle. Harry's breath painted clouds in the air because it was bitterly cold even behind the walls. He reached the spiral staircase that led to the tower and stepped onto the first step. He walked slowly up it, a strong gust of wind made him shiver and he pulled his scarf up over his chin. Once he reached the tower, the scarf didn't help much either. Harry braced himself against the icy wind and buried his hands deep in his wizard's robe. He walked to the edge of the tower and peered down, the storm or something making his hair stand on end as he remembered Dumbledore falling from that very tower, mouth opening in a silent "oh" after green light had burst from his chest. Harry shuddered, took a step back and blinked to banish the memory. Then he drew his wand and hesitated. He could take the wand with him, he had clutched it in his claws during a flight before, just to try it out, but that would compromise his cover and he had no use for it in his animagus form anyway. But flying to Azkaban without a wand seemed kind of stupid. Stupid and brave, he thought, and then he frowned, put the wand down and stood at the edge of the tower again. The transformation came easier than he expected with a little practice. He only needed a minute or two of preparation, during which he cleared his mind. Since he knew that this fluttering feeling between his ribs was the first sign of the transformation, at least that's how he explained it to himself, he hadn't found anything about it in the animagus books, he let it happen and the fluttering became a regular beating that felt like it was touching his heart and changing it. The feeling wasn't painful, but it was incredibly unfamiliar. It reminded Harry of his apparition experiences, when the gentle beats, which were like flapping wings, reached his navel. It was like a gentle jolt that went through his body. Harry shrieked as he opened his eyes, spread his wings and threw himself from the astronomy tower. For the first time in a long time, he felt like Harry Potter again, because there was hardly anything more normal in his life than being stupid and brave. It took him over a week to find Azkaban. He managed to reach the coast within 2 days. After that, he had spent 5 days literally scouring the sea. Icy wind and lashing rain had sapped his strength, and now he was perched on a steep rock near the shore, preening his feathers to make them water-repellent again, as a few splashes from the churning waves reached him. 2 seagulls sat a little lower on the same rock, staring up at him. Their heads moved jerkily and restlessly as they pecked at a muscle that they obviously couldn't open. Harry screeched and moved towards them on the rock. His claws found a secure hold on the bizarre, dark stone despite the storm, and he screeched again as he approached. The seagulls were a little smaller than him, and when he spread his wings threateningly, one of them flew up and began to circle above the rock, apparently waiting for his companion. The second seagull had its head tilted and was shifting from one foot to the other. Harry folded his wings again and went closer. The seagull screeched and moved its beak in his direction. Instinctively, Harry rose half a meter into the air to avoid it and landed behind it. In a matter of seconds, he had the muscle in his beak and pushed himself off the rock. He flew to a second rock, which also protruded from the sea closer to the coast, and tapped the muscle on a corner of the rock until it opened. He pecked out the meat from the inside and gobbled it down greedily. He hadn't eaten anything for days, but he realized that the animagus book had been right, crows really were tough. He tilted his head back and looked up along the cliff. Azkaban Castle was gloomy and somewhat impressive, and Harry thought he could make out a few shadows of Dementors hovering above it. He didn't sense their presence yet. Maybe a little from the damp cold, but it was cold anyway, and damp from the sea, so he couldn't quite tell the difference. He clacked his beak as he thought, it was a stupid habit, and finally he hopped determinedly to the highest point of the rock to take off. The wind blew him 2 meters to the side at first before he regained his balance and was able to fly against it. It had taken him longer than necessary to find Azkaban because the storm over the sea kept throwing him off course, but he had gotten used to it now. He flew up the cliff. A flock of his own kind scattered when they saw him coming, squawking and circling around him. Harry ignored them, only clacking his beak once when one came too close. She screeched in outrage and flew away again, while Harry climbed higher, arriving at the fortress and finally settling on a tower pinnacle. The familiar cold spread through him and he shivered and prepared to fly away again, but then he stopped when the cold feeling remained and he neither heard his mother's scream nor the lifeless eyes of Dumbledore or the shadow of Sirius falling through the curtain appeared in his mind. Instead, he remembered that Sirius had once told him how he had managed to escape from Azkaban, in his animagus form because the Dementors could do less harm that way. So if that really was true of all animagi, Harry hesitantly pushed himself off the battlement, floating with his wings spread along the fortress a little further down because he had seen a window there. It was not a window that a human could fit through, it was a gap in the castle wall, a little more than a hand's breadth wide, and Harry fit right into it in his crow form. He sat down on the windowsill. His claws made scraping noises on the damp stone as he walked forward on the wide ledge to look down. He froze when his gaze fell on white blonde hair, abstractly glowing in the darkness of the cell and half hidden by the hood of a musty cloak. 4 meters below him, Malfoy was crouched motionless in the far corner, exactly where they had photographed him, and Harry couldn't help but wonder if he was still alive, and with a horrible shudder he wanted to call out to him, but instead of Malfoy, only a desperate, questioning screech came from his beak, which was somehow more piercing than usual. Her frozen hand takes your breath away, as she leads your soul through the dark. You know that she came to break your heart. But oh, when she moves you fall in love again. There was nothing left of him. When Harry landed on the damp stone floor at his feet, he didn't move, but Harry saw the cloak rise and fall with regular breaths. They were too shallow for him to sleep, so Harry clacked his beak softly and hopped cautiously 2 steps closer. He turned his head, blinking, as a wave of cold washed over him and saw a Dementor float past the narrow bars, heard its rattling breath. Malfoy whimpered, and Harry was relieved at the sign of life. He saw Malfoy trying to wrap the cloak tighter around himself, burying his face even deeper in it. Harry hopped a step forward, then back again, restlessly, as Malfoy moved. Not knowing what to do, he swore helplessly, a deep rumbling sound coming from his throat, and Malfoy made a strangled noise. "Dad," he whined, crouching even smaller. "Dad, there's a crow here. It's going to want to eat me, Dad." His voice trembled and cracked and had gotten louder by the end, and something in it, perhaps the harsh panic, made Harry dizzy. He put distance between them as Malfoy whimpered. "That means I'm going to die soon, Dad. She knows it." Harry didn't know it was worse, that Malfoy really believed that, or that he wasn't getting an answer. Instead, the Dementor came back and Harry instinctively retreated to the back wall of the cell as he stopped in front of the bars and breathed in greedily, swallowing up Malfoy's fear, and as Malfoy hoarsely screamed his mother's name and choked and pressed his head against the dungeon walls, Harry intuitively beat his wings 2 or 3 times and flew between him and the Dementor. It was a strange feeling, the way the Dementor took its next breath, and Harry braced himself against the cold and screams, and he actually heard his mother's scream, but it was muffled and not piercingly loud in his head. He tried to think of something happy and to push away the cold hand that reached for his small, fluttering black body, tried to keep his wings beats regular and noticed that it worked. He couldn't conjure up a Patronus, but he could shield himself. "I'll get him out of here," he thought, spreading his wings to their full extent and hearing the Dementor stop breathing. He hovered motionless in front of the bars of the cell for a while, then moved 2 or 3 meters away, and Harry turned quickly to Malfoy. He flew to him, forgetting caution or fear of contact this time, and landed gently on his shoulder. He felt Malfoy tense and did not fold his wings completely, expecting him to strike at him, but nothing happened, and Harry wondered if he could even muster the strength to do so. The body felt bony and fragile under his claws. Malfoy lifted his head, just a little, and turned it, and stared straight into his face. He opened his mouth, eyes wide, and Harry thought he was going to scream and tried somehow to stop him with his stare, because that would bring the Dementor back, and Malfoy actually did not scream. There was confusion behind the panic in the gray eyes, and Malfoy finally blinked and closed his mouth. Relieved, Harry dug his claws a little into his damp cloak and felt the tremors that then shook Malfoy's weakened body. Trembling, He pressed himself harder against the dungeon wall and Harry wondered if there was already a hollow in the stone if Malfoy had been standing in this exact position for months. In the middle of the cell lay some crusts of bread. Some were moldy because they had gotten damp, others were rock hard and dry. Harry flew over and grabbed one of them with his beak. He swallowed 2 crumbs that slipped down his throat before returning to Malfoy. He let them fall into his lap and found space on his shoulder again. Malfoy looked down at the bread, then turned his head abruptly and there was confusion in his eyes and then a hint of madness. "Mum must have sent you," he whispered hoarsely and sounded so childishly confident that something in Harry's chest hurt terribly. He clacked his beak and, following an impulse, pressed his head against Malfoy's temple. The tremor that shook his body was a desperate sob, and he began to mutter "Mum" and "please," over and over again. Harry swallowed and swayed on his shoulder as Malfoy gently rocked his upper body back and forth. He hopped onto the stone floor, next to Malfoy's foot, and tapped the bread with his beak. He needed to eat something. Malfoy looked down, his eyes red, his lips rough and chapped. "I promised, Mum," he said choked, before reaching for the bread with long, thin fingers. Harry didn't know what to do. He had searched for and found Narcissa Malfoy's cell, and was relieved that she did not appear as emaciated as Draco. She had kept her composure, sitting still and cross-legged in the middle of her cell when Harry landed next to her knee. She blinked down at him, the calm expression on her face frightened Harry for a few seconds. Then she reached out and touched his shiny feathers, stroked one wing and then let her hand fall again. Her gaze was unreadable, she looked back and forth between his eyes. At some point she whispered, "Help him," and held a pale palm in front of his face. Harry buried his head in it and swore that he would free Draco Malfoy from Azkaban. He just didn't know how. Lost in thought, he stared out to sea from the top of the castle. The storm caused the waves to break on the cliffs. They made a hell of a noise. Harry's feathers turned against the wind and he shivered and turned a little so that he was more in the direction of the wind. He had to go back to Hogwarts and do something from there. He could talk to McGonagall and Kingsley, to Dumbledore's portrait, someone had to help him. He didn't want to leave without saying goodbye. With his wings spread wide, he flew down once more to the window-like gap above Draco's cell. He hopped through and sank down on the stone floor near Draco's feet. He had finished eating the bread and Harry had the impression that his breathing was deeper and was just wondering if he was asleep when he raised his head. He looked calmer now, the expression in his eyes no longer flickering, panicked or confused, but more solid. He asked, "Can you hear me?" Harry noticed that his eyes widened. It was good that Malfoy was still sharp, wasn't it? A good sign. He nodded slowly and saw Malfoy inhale sharply. Then his face took on an urgent expression. "Have you been to see my mother?" Harry nodded again. Another sharp inhale from Malfoy. "Is she alive?" Harry nodded more vigorously and the tension left Malfoy's body. He sank back against the dungeon wall, looking as haggard as ever, and Harry could see that he was shaking. He hesitated, then carefully reached out a foot, dug his claws into the cloak at Malfoy's ankle, and stepped onto it. He hopped carefully up over his thigh, trying not to think about how odd this was, and when he reached his lap, pressed himself against the side of his torso. Not feeling any body heat was unsettling and Harry wondered how cold Malfoy really was. He pressed himself closer to him and after a while a thin arm slipped around his body. Merlin, Harry would never be able to tell him that it was Harry Potter he had hugged so carefully in his cell in Azkaban that night, as if he was afraid of crushing him. But giving Malfoy a little warmth felt good. It was the first really good feeling since Voldemort's fall, because it felt like he was making up for something and like he was really doing something. Something really useful. Something important. Not studying for his newts or listening to Bin's lament about the history of magic. He noticed that he was getting sleepy. The trip to Azkaban had left him emaciated and he didn't want to know how much weight he had lost. He wouldn't notice until he transformed back. He let his eyes close. Maybe it would be good to get a night's sleep before flying back, he thought with one last thought before drifting off to sleep, shielding Malfoy's heart from Dementor's attacks with his body. As Harry flew over the snowy landscape and Hogwarts slowly drew closer, he could think of nothing else but how tightly Malfoy had held him, so tightly that it had been hard to free himself from his grip. His murmuring in his sleep. "Help, please." The warm breath on Harry's head and cool fingers that he had buried in black feathers somewhere on Harry's back, so careful and subtle that not a single one of them was bent or twisted afterwards. "No, you don't understand. Malfoy has to get out of there now." Harry had both hands propped up on McGonagall's desk. He felt Hermione's horrified look on the back of his neck and saw McGonagall swallow. "Mr. Potter, you have been missing for over a week. I demand an explanation for, But she did not sound as if she could demand anything of him, and Harry was clearly aware of this as her gaze flickered. She thought he was going mad, perhaps she was even afraid of him, he could sense it. Perhaps he had frightened her when he had rushed frantically into her office, pale-faced, thin, with glowing eyes, blind with anger or despair. "Harry, where have you been?" He turned briefly to Hermione. She had dark rings under her eyes and her face looked white. "We were so worried," she whispered, coming to him and tentatively touching his arm, as if she first had to test whether he would allow her to touch him. He pushed her away. "I'm not mad," he snapped, because Hermione's obvious concern made it seem as if she thought he was sick, in some way. She put some distance between them, but looked patient and not offended. "Then tell us what happened. Please. So we can help you." Her voice was too calm. Didn't they understand that he didn't have time for that? Getting Malfoy out of Azkaban was much more important than constantly explaining himself, finding words for things he couldn't explain, and being upset after everything that had happened that they still couldn't believe him unconditionally when he asked them for something so urgently. He thought that he wasn't the only one who had learned to trust his instincts. Hermione and McGonagall knew that just as well. He stared back and forth between them and realized that he couldn't expect any help from them. Maybe if he had thought about it properly, he could have understood that they were suspicious after he had simply disappeared without a trace for over a week and came back with a frantic request to free Malfoy from Azkaban immediately. Malfoy of all people. But Harry had no time to think properly about anything, and he was not going to take the time while Malfoy was stuck in this shithole whining his mother's name. He cursed, pushed past Hermione and rushed out of the office. He ran through the corridors of Hogwarts. The students had returned from the Christmas holidays and he could only push past a few Ravenclaws with vigorous elbow use. He ignored their protests, which died down anyway when they recognized him. When he arrived in Dumbledore's office, he stopped close to his portrait. "Professor, I was in Azkaban. The Malfoys must be freed. I mean, Mrs. Malfoy and Draco." The name tasted foreign on his tongue. He gasped for breath and Dumbledore looked at him piercingly over his glasses. "Harry, I have a request," he whispered, and when Harry looked at him more closely, it almost seemed as if there were a few new wrinkles on his face that he hadn't noticed before. "Don't ever worry us like that again." Harry remained stubbornly silent and clenched his hands into fists. He did not understand that no one saw that time was really pressing and that they had no time for such trivialities. "Please," he cried, looking around the office desperately, as if there was anyone else here except a portrait that could not help him. His gaze fell on Fawkes and he rushed towards him and looked into the ancient, wise face. "Please, Fawkes." He didn't care that he was making a fool of himself, but Fawkes just trilled sadly and Harry whirled around. "I have to help them. He's going mad. He'll die otherwise. He saved my life, he didn't betray me. And I saved his life, in the fight, in the room of requirement, before the fire." This created a strange connection between Malfoy and him, which he perhaps only realized when he said it. It was as if he could no longer hate him because of what had happened and for some reason could not even leave him to himself. Malfoy had not left him to himself when they had actually hated each other, and that was much more serious than 6 years of petty wars at school. He gestured towards Dumbledore, who was watching him carefully, and Harry took a breath to calm himself down. "Sir, Malfoy belongs at Hogwarts. He has to finish his school-leaving certificate. He is a student. You said that every student at Hogwarts is under your protection." Harry stared stubbornly into his eyes for a moment, then ruffled his hair in frustration when Dumbledore still didn't respond. "I want him here," he said when he had dropped his hand, and it sounded crazy, even to his own ears, but as soon as he said it, he realized how right he was. Maybe he found Hogwarts desolate because Malfoy wasn't there. Because Malfoy was part of Hogwarts, no matter how annoying and horrible Harry found him. "Here at Hogwarts," he added firmly, nodding, somehow needing to confirm that to himself. Dumbledore's expression softened. "You will not leave the castle again," he said, calmly but firmly, and Harry was about to snap and protest again, but Dumbledore silenced him with a cutting wave of his hand. "But I will do what I can for Draco Malfoy and his mother." His gaze wandered to Fawkes and he said his name, lowering his chin in his direction. Fawkes made a high, warbling sound and spread his wings. "And she spreads her wings when she's gonna fly. The crow, if you make her sing when she's coming, she will let you know she spreads her wings and they black out the sun. You won't hear her sing and she'll leave when the damage is done." Harry had no idea how Dumbledore did it. Hell, the man was trapped in a portrait. Nevertheless, 3 days after Dumbledore sent Fawkes on his way, Aurors brought Malfoy to Hogwarts. Fawkes followed them, floating down the corridor to the hospital wing, and Harry followed Fawkes. Malfoy lay on a stretcher that was floating 2 feet above the ground. One of the Aurors maintained the levitation charm with his wand. The second was chatting with McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey. Harry caught a few words. Couldn't get up, unconscious, Dementors, awake, panicked, unconscious. He tried to make sense of it, but couldn't. Fawkes warbled softly and flew out a window and out into the grounds. Harry suspected he would recover in Dumbledore's office. Most of the students moved aside in awe as the Aurors crossed the castle with McGonagall, Madame Pomfrey, the unconscious Draco Malfoy, and Harry Potter in tow. Only once did a sixth-year call out, "Professor! Why are you bringing him back here, Professor? He's a Death Eater. Go to your common room, Waxley," McGonagall said without looking, and continued to accompany Madame Pomfrey and the Aurors. That night, Harry transformed into the Crow and flew to the hospital wing. The door was locked, so he croaked irritably, turned around and looked for a window from which he could circle the castle and enter the hospital wing through another window. He quickly found a way and sat on the windowsill. Malfoy's hair shone in the moonlight. Harry's bird form cast a shadow on his pale face. Malfoy was sleeping. As quietly as possible, Harry spread his wings and landed on his bedside table next to an empty glass vial. Perhaps a sleeping potion or even one for dreamless sleep, because Malfoy was sleeping soundly and somehow Harry doubted that one had a peaceful sleep when one had been sitting in Azkaban a few hours earlier. They had exchanged his tattered, damp cloak for a pair of pajamas. Harry saw the silky, dark green sleeve because Malfoy had wrapped one arm around the bedclothes. It had ridden up a little, revealing a pale, scrawny wrist. The sharp bone protruded in a triangular shape and Harry blinked at the sudden urge to touch the wrist in that exact spot. He wanted to press his beak against it or lean his head against it, and he hopped back a step restlessly on the bedside table and froze when Malfoy moved his head in his sleep. "Mum," he murmured, and Harry saw his slender fingers hook into the bedclothes. "Don't, Mum." It was just a soundless whisper, and Harry wondered if the nightmares were so bad that the dreamless potion couldn't help, and if Malfoy would have screamed out loud if he hadn't taken it. A week passed and Malfoy was still in the hospital wing. When Harry visited him at night in the form of the Crow, however, he had the impression that he no longer looked too ill. On the 8th day after Malfoy's return, he visited Professor McGonagall in her office. "Professor," he asked, shaking his head as she offered him biscuits. "When can Malfoy attend classes again?" "I mean, because of his wand," he hastened to say, and McGonagall clasped her hands together and looked at him seriously. "In a few days, Mr. Malfoy will be released from the hospital wing. However, that does not mean that you can give him his wand back. The Ministry insists that he is not given a wand until the end of his intended sentence. During the summer holidays, a thorough check will be carried out to see whether he is, well, not a danger." "Danger? Malfoy?" Harry coughed and raised his eyebrows. "How is he supposed to attend classes without a wand?" Her lips curled into a somewhat helpless smile. "Potions, history of magic, arithmancy, herbology, Muggle studies? Professor, you're talking about Malfoy. Well, he'll be given a timetable so he doesn't hang around in the hours he needs his wand," she replied pointedly, and for some reason Harry grinned and imagined Malfoy taking a vacuum cleaner apart and inspecting its inner workings. Harry saw Malfoy's shoulders tense as Harry stood next to his desk during the first potions class he attended after his stay in Azkaban in the hospital wing. "Potter," he snarled, and something inside Harry glowed with relief that Malfoy was just being Malfoy and didn't sound like he'd gone mad. There was perhaps a little less aggression in his voice than usual, but maybe Harry was just imagining it. He grinned and held the handle of his school bag so it didn't slip off his shoulder. "What do you want?" Malfoy asked irritably, looking up at his face, and Harry remembered disorientated confusion and panic in the grey eyes, which were now familiarly cool and condescending, but still touched something strangely warm in Harry, making him shiver involuntarily. He said, not very quick-witted, and blinked, and Malfoy raised an eyebrow. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm keeping your wand," Harry said thoughtfully, and Malfoy looked genuinely surprised. "The Ministry confiscated it." Harry shrugged. "They wanted to. They didn't." Malfoy frowned ever so slightly, then nodded and turned back to the potion ingredients he had already placed on his desk. Harry thought the conversation was over and was about to leave, but he stopped him. "Potter." Harry looked at him over his shoulder and was sure this time that his name sounded less aggressive than before the war. Maybe they had grown up. Maybe they were both too tired to fight anymore. "Thank you." Harry hesitated and turned to him. He didn't know what Malfoy meant and wondered for a moment, startled, if he knew that it was Harry who had visited him in his cell as a crow, but that was impossible. Malfoy's mouth twisted into A half smirk. "Guess Hogwarts is better than Azkaban despite your presence," he sneered. Harry frowned. "Who told you that McGonagall couldn't help making a hero out of you?" Again. He waved him off and Harry understood that the conversation was really over this time and went to his seat. He plopped down next to Hermione and ran his hand through his hair, amazed that he was confused and feeling strange. He looked around and it seemed to him that this dungeon was a little less bleak. Malfoy had hardly changed. It seemed that way, anyway, but Harry knew better. Harry hid behind a statue in the evenings until the last Slytherins went into the common room, and carefully and as quietly as possible he hopped or flew after them. Sometimes they noticed him anyway, but it was evident that some student just didn't have their new pet under control. It hadn't taken him long to find out where Malfoy slept. It was different from Gryffindor, where they had their shared dormitories. In Slytherin, a long corridor behind the common room led to individual small bedrooms, and when Harry had first flown down the corridor, where it was dark and the stone of the dungeon walls was almost black, he had thought that if he were in Malfoy's place it would remind him terribly of Azkaban. The bedrooms were old prison cells. Harry realized that at the latest when he noticed the small window to the corridor in each room, quite high up in the walls. It was perfect for his crow form to hop through, but too small for any human to escape. It was quite obvious that Harry was not the only one who was unpleasantly reminded of Azkaban, although Malfoy's bedroom was comfortably furnished. More chaotic than Harry would have expected. A large mirror hung on one side of the wall, a large torch on the other. A narrow black leather sofa stood in one corner of the room, and one evening when Harry was up quite early, Malfoy sat there leafing through a book, his knees drawn up to his body on the seat. When Harry came and Malfoy was already asleep, he almost always had nightmares. Harry found it difficult to connect the whimpering, sometimes screaming boy with the Malfoy who snarled his surname in potions class and smiled mockingly when he made a mistake. It was more than a month before Harry gave up fighting the urge to touch Malfoy when his sleep became restless. He simply allowed himself to be overwhelmed, climbing up onto the mattress from the bedside table as carefully as possible and placing his beak on the sharp spot on his wrist that had attracted him in the hospital wing. "You look terrible. I thought you were better, but, are you having trouble sleeping? Are you having nightmares again?" Hermione looked at him worriedly while Harry yawned at the breakfast table. He shook his head and felt increasingly guilty about deceiving her and sometimes even lying to her in order to disappear from the common room in the evenings. She had given up asking him about the week he had disappeared. Instead, she was obviously just relieved that he was eating more and attending class more, and after he had briefly clashed with Malfoy one day in potions, she had given him a mischievous smile. "You're arguing with him again?" Harry had raised his eyebrows and slammed his bag onto the table in annoyance. "So what?" "Oh," she said, shaking her head with a grin. "Nothing. I just think that's good. You haven't argued since, and that just wasn't like you." One night in March, Harry was seized by a sharp panic when Malfoy, who he had thought was asleep, sat up like a rocket as Harry hopped onto his mattress and grabbed him. Instinctively, Harry spread his wings and fluttered defensively to get away from him. He actually managed to smack one hand away from Malfoy, but soon an entire arm simply clamped around his body, preventing his wings from flapping. He shrieked in outrage and Malfoy swore as he lashed out at him with his beak. "Hold still, you crazy beast. I don't want to hurt you." Only slowly did Harry stop struggling and Malfoy's grip loosened a little. Not much, not that he needed his wings, but it was no longer uncomfortable and with a pounding heart Harry thought about how absurd it was that he was crouching in Malfoy's bed, who had his arm wrapped completely around Harry's body and was looking at him skeptically. "Who are you?" Harry was silent and was pretty sure he would have blushed if he hadn't just taken the form of a crow. "You're not a pet. Let the others think that, but I'm not stupid. You're an animagus." Harry narrowed his eyes, realizing too late that the blink could be interpreted as agreement. When he opened them again, Malfoy was smiling, and Harry caught his breath involuntarily, realizing that he had never seen Malfoy smile before, not so genuine, not so careful. He loosened his grip even more. "You come here every night, don't you? And you visited me in Azkaban." He was whispering, and Harry could feel himself tensing up. "I thought my mother sent you. But that was nonsense, she wouldn't have had the chance." His voice trailed off until he finally said, "Guess I was just confused by Azkaban." And he looked at Harry's face again, eyes wide and up close. They were more silver than gray, softer, more fluid somehow and childishly confused. Harry swallowed and a jolt went through his body as Malfoy's fingers gently touched and stroked his head and a gentle shiver ran down Harry's back. "Who are you? Like a friend?" He stopped stroking his head and back for a moment, but did not remove his fingers. "I don't have many friends here. Actually, I don't have any friends at all. Since Crabbe died, I think I remind him too much of him. That's why Goyle is different." Harry could do nothing but stare at him. He couldn't believe that Malfoy was just talking to him like that, and something inside him urged him to fight back, to break free of his grip and fly away because he felt like a spy, because Malfoy would never tell him these things if he knew that the crow crouching in front of him was none other than Harry Potter. "Most people are different to me. Some are afraid, I think. But most people just hate me. Potter is the same as always." He paused, as if he needed to think about it for a moment. "Maybe not quite as annoying as usual. I think we've fought enough. Only sometimes, when we still want to be children." He stopped and started again. "Sometimes," he said again, swallowed, and something in his expression changed. His eyes became more piercing, and as he continued, his voice was husky. "I imagine you were Severus. A crow would suit him somehow." For a brief moment, Harry was absolutely aware that if Malfoy had been human and not a crow, he would have simply pulled him into his arms, because he looked so helpless that there was simply nothing else he could have done in that second but wrap his arms around him and try to make him a little stronger. Malfoy looked at him, a poorly concealed hope on his face, as if he expected Harry to simply turn into Snape before his eyes and then perhaps praise him for his wit in an oily voice and a curled smile. He suddenly wondered how close the bond between Malfoy and Snape had been. How much Malfoy might have known about Snape, his loyalty to Dumbledore and to Harry's mother. "But Severus wouldn't touch my hand if I had a bad dream." His voice was now just a whisper, and the clammy hope on his face disappeared, giving way to a bitter expression. "He'd grab my shoulder and wake me up. He did a few times, back when he was at the manor a lot." He yawned and let go of Harry, and his head told Harry to just spread his wings and fly away, but his body didn't obey him as Malfoy lay back down, long fingers lazily stroking his feathers once he got comfortable. Harry woke up when someone nudged him. "Hey! Never seen such a lazy bird." He sounded amused, and Harry jumped up and stretched his wings because they had fallen asleep. He was still crouched in Malfoy's bed. Malfoy was standing by the edge of the bed in his Slytherin robes, studying him with his arms folded across his chest, looking so good doing it. With the crooked grin and the half-mocking, but also half-soft sparkle in his eyes that Harry didn't recognize and that turned the gray into silver, and the challengingly jutting out of his chin that made Harry feel sick involuntarily. He couldn't think that of Malfoy. He jumped off the bed and flew to the small window in the wall. His heart was pounding so hard against his ribs that the feathers on his chest were vibrating gently. He swallowed and was so surprised that he no longer felt miserable about Malfoy at all, but more alive than he had in a very, very long time. Cold heart, warm gun, a dying sun, bright eyes, black soul, she'll never let you go. Harry did not give in to his urgent need to speak to Hermione straight away. There was so much to explain, she would have 1,000 or more questions, but Harry himself did not know any answers. When he felt drawn to Malfoy in the evenings and could only just resist the overwhelming urge, he sometimes tried and started talking, saying something like, "So when I was away for so long," but when Hermione's piercing gaze met him, he would break off and flee to Dumbledore's office. It would be easier if Ron were there. "It's a big secret you're carrying around with you," Dumbledore said, without asking questions, and Harry stared at him. Dumbledore looked at him kindly over half-moon glasses and smiled, and Harry tried to tell himself he meant the animagus and certainly not the pressing feeling that he should be in Malfoy's bedchamber instead of Dumbledore's office, touching his wrist gently with his beak when his sleep became disturbed. He swallowed and turned away from Dumbledore. His gaze wandered to the cupboard where Dumbledore's pensieve was kept. He wasn't sure why he did it afterwards. Perhaps he wanted to remind himself that he and Malfoy were actually something like enemies. They had been for years, and Harry couldn't remember ever feeling anything but loathing towards him. Now there was something else tugging at his ribs, frighteningly bright and clear, and Harry felt miserable about it. He wished it was pity, but he couldn't tell himself that any longer. When he watched himself curse Malfoy and moaning Myrtle's Lou in the pensieve, he thought that maybe it would make him feel better. When he pulled his head out of the pensieve when Snape came, though, he felt more like he was going to throw up. It occurred to him that they could have handled this differently. He was startled as an image flashed before his eyes of him simply moving faster to Malfoy and wrapping his arms around him instead of drawing his wand. Maybe then Malfoy would he? Harry blinked to clear the image, and realized his cheeks were red. Malfoy would never have let him comfort him or help him. What was he thinking? He wasn't even doing it now, unless Harry was a crow. He instinctively ran his hand through his hair, ruffling it even more, and met Dumbledore's gaze as he looked up. It was piercing and somehow gentle. "Don't get me wrong," Dumbledore said, smiling. I really appreciate your company. But I have this unsteady feeling that you should be somewhere else." He winked. Harry nodded and went to stand by the window. He could hear Fawkes' high-pitched warbling in his ears as he transformed. A few days later, he did tell Hermione why he had spent so much time in Dumbledore's office and why he had been missing for almost 10 days. She was shocked, as expected, and then he had to transform back and forth in front of her a dozen times. She was fascinated, and for a few minutes Harry felt like her personal research subject. He answered her questions patiently, only omitting the fact that he had spent almost every night in Malfoy's bedroom since then. Later, he thought. He could perhaps tell her this tiny detail later. It was a potions class where Harry just couldn't take his eyes off Malfoy because he had noticed something that was making his heart do strange things in his chest. The tip of a black feather protruded from Malfoy's cloak, which parted above his white shirt because it was the first warm spring day of the year. It was obviously halfway into the cloak and reached from there to the button placket of Malfoy's shirt, and Harry couldn't take his eyes off it, counting the breaths as the feather rose and fell so gently as if it were the regular beats of wings, and froze when Malfoy returned his gaze. He almost fell off his chair, just managing to hold onto the table and accidentally knocking over his test tube of flubberworm essence. "Oh Harry." Hermione drew her wand and magicked her desk clean before the flubberworm essence reached the other potion ingredients. "Sorry." When Harry raised his head again, Malfoy was concentrating on his work again. He had pulled the cloak further together in the middle so that the tip of the feather was no longer visible. "Are you visiting anyone else in the castle?" Harry jumped. He had thought that Malfoy had fallen asleep and had placed the beak on his wrist. He no longer needed a nightmare as an excuse. Malfoy did not pull his hand away. Harry blinked up at him and shook his head. "Oh," said Malfoy, sitting up and running his hand through his hair. "Good. Potter saw one of your feathers today and had something like a fit afterward." He grimaced and Harry's heart clenched as he casually stroked his feathers before standing up. Harry's gaze slid restlessly over his body. It finally settled on the back of his head, his light blonde hair a pale patch in the darkness. "I can't sleep." He looked a little annoyed. His shoulders were tense and intuitively Harry spread his wings, made 2 or 3 powerful beats and landed gently on his left shoulder. He froze when Malfoy pressed his cheek against him, just like that, such a thoughtless, perhaps instinctive gesture, but for Harry it felt for a few seconds as if Malfoy had frozen time. He was so close he could feel his breath. Silky blonde hair caressed his beak and, seized by a sudden panic, Harry dug his claws into Malfoy's shoulders, pushed himself off and flew away. He landed safely on the windowsill, 10 feet up, while Malfoy cursed. "Fuck, are you crazy? You scratched me." He pulled the sleeve of his pajamas over his shoulder and squinted at the white skin. Even from a distance, Harry could see 3 small, bloody welts and clicked his beak. Nothing that would kill Malfoy. But Malfoy still seemed pretty annoyed and glared at him. "I can't heal this, stupid bird. I hate it without a want. It's all so complicated." He continued to curse quietly to himself as he headed for the bathroom. Harry heard water running shortly afterwards and Malfoy hissing. He was probably washing the scratches off. When he returned, it looked as if he had splashed water on his face too. His cheeks were flushed, and Harry was unpleasantly reminded of the scene in Moaning Myrtle's Loo, only now he was hoping he wasn't a crow, but Harry, and could throw his arms around Malfoy instead of cursing him. In the end, it was Hermione who brought the secret crashing down like a carefully constructed barricade. It happened quite casually. There was no big bang or dramatic drum roll. Harry sat wearily at breakfast and Hermione said simply, "You really should stop these nightly crow excursions wherever they are, now before the newts." She said it quietly, but not quietly enough. A noise behind them made Harry jump. He whirled around. Right behind him was Malfoy, a book, messily open, lying at his feet. It had probably slipped from his hand. He stared at Harry. And Harry stared back, unable to say anything. He saw in Malfoy's eyes that in a second he thought of everything he had said to Harry, how he had held him, how he had stroked him, and Harry knew him well enough to recognize in a tiny moment the sheer panic on his face. Then he fled from the great hall with long strides, but not running, and Harry mechanically stood up and bent down to pick up his book. "I should bring him the," he actually wanted to say, but he was surprised when Hermione touched his hand and briefly squeezed his fingers. Harry looked flickeringly into her eyes and knew that she had put 2 and 2 together, and Hermione was unbeatably good at putting things together. "You should," she said, and somehow Harry had the feeling that it was about something completely different than just the book. He knew where he would find him. He gained access to Slytherin's common room as a crow. 2 third-year girls had obviously overslept, and after they had rushed outside to the dungeon corridor, Harry quickly hopped into the common room. There he transformed, quite relieved, because Malfoy's book was heavy for a crow, and shivered, hunching his shoulders. As a crow, he had a different perception of temperature. He had not noticed that it was much cooler here than in Gryffindor Tower. He went to the dormitories and resisted the urge to draw his wand as he walked from dungeon door to dungeon door. It was dark and Harry felt like he was being watched, but there was no one there. It was just the paranoia that he would probably never get over after the war. He stopped at Malfoy's door and hesitated. It was a pretty tricky situation, really, but then again, tricky situations seemed to be something of his specialty, so Harry straightened his shoulders, held the book in front of his chest like a shield in case Malfoy planned something dangerous, beating him up, for example, since he didn't have a wand, and knocked. He wasn't particularly surprised when he got no answer, so he just reached for the knob and tried to open the door. It had only moved an inch when it slammed shut again and Harry recoiled, astonished. "You won't do that, Potter." It sounded as if Malfoy had simply braced himself against the door. For some unknown reason, Harry had to smile. For a moment he considered pushing against it and turning it into a strange test of strength. But then he thought of Moaning Myrtle's toilet and decided that he didn't want to test his strength against Malfoy anymore. He stepped back from the door, tilted his head back and closed his eyes. He counted 10 seconds, it didn't take him any longer to turn into the crow. He clicked his beak and hopped over the book that was lying in front of Malfoy's door with his wand. Then he spread his wings and flew with 3 or 4 powerful beats to the small window in the wall. He sat down on a ledge and looked down. Malfoy hadn't noticed him yet. He was standing in front of the door, in fact, he had his back against it and his expression was quite grim. A few tightly combed strands of hair had come loose and fell into his distorted face. He blew upwards because they obviously tickled him, but the tension in his arms and shoulders didn't ease for a second. At some point he snarled, "Potter?" And Harry hopped up to the edge of the windowsill and spread his wings. He dropped to the floor right in front of Malfoy's feet. Malfoy stared at him. He was still pressed against the door, although that was completely unnecessary now. Harry blinked up into his face and hopped back and forth restlessly, an annoying crow habit. Malfoy's eyes narrowed. "Asshole." Harry relaxed, stood in one place, and a strange silence fell. Finally, Harry instinctively spread his wings in alarm when Malfoy simply dropped to the floor along the door where he was and suddenly sat opposite him. Harry folded his wings back together and looked at him suspiciously. He knew full well that Malfoy was most dangerous when he was at his weakest. He had learned that in 6th year. Malfoy stared at him, his expression completely unreadable. Harry wouldn't have been surprised if he had grabbed him with his bare hands and twisted his thin neck, or if he had reached out and gently stroked his feathers with slender fingers. He did neither. Instead he ran both hands over his face in a languid gesture, a few hairs falling over his fingertips, and through his fingers he looked at Harry again. "Why is it always you, Potter?" He's not really angry. That's weird. Hermione looked up from her spell textbook. "You're supposed to write your transfiguration essay." "I mean, I don't know." Harry ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "I think I'd freak out if Malfoy spent the nights in our dormitory." Hermione put her finger between the pages and closed the book in annoyance. "Maybe freaking out is beneath Malfoy, Harry." Harry was silent and bent his head over his essay. He felt Hermione's gaze on the back of his head and tried to look as if he was paying attention as possible, even though there was nothing else in his head but white blonde hair and silver eyes. 2 or 3 minutes later, she sighed. Or it just didn't bother him. It sounded as if she was smiling a little. Harry's heart was racing as he sat on Malfoy's windowsill the following night. Because his heart was much smaller in the crow's body, it was more of a terribly restless flicker than a strong pounding, and Harry felt uncomfortable. He saw Malfoy's light hair shining under the covers. He had flown into the dungeons as late as possible so that Malfoy would already be asleep when he arrived. Although that was nonsense, because how was he supposed to find out whether Malfoy was not disturbing his company if he didn't even notice it? But Harry simply didn't have the courage to do more than that. He flew quietly through the bedroom and landed gently on Malfoy's bedside table. He was relieved that Malfoy was obviously quite tidy and never left anything on his bedside table so that he couldn't accidentally sweep anything onto the floor. This way he was quiet enough that Malfoy didn't wake up. He lay on his side facing Harry. Silky light hair fell over his cheek and Harry suppressed the clear desire to push it back over Malfoy's temple with his beak. He was sleeping very peacefully and for some unknown reason Harry was now considering waking him. Out of pure curiosity, because he wanted to know what Malfoy would do then. But at the thought his heart started fluttering again and he hesitantly hopped back and forth on the bedside table. Then he stopped again and for a while he just watched Malfoy sleep. When he murmured something restlessly and Harry saw his fingers digging deeper into the covers, it was an impulse or maybe even a habit that made him stretch his head down and put his beak on Malfoy's wrist. He froze when Malfoy opened his eyes. The first time, they closed immediately and Harry wanted to pull back and take a breath of relief, when Malfoy blinked and opened them again. He looked at him. "Potter," he murmured, his voice still hoarse from sleep, and he moved a little under the covers. "I hope you realize," he said, his eyes closing again, "that I would cast the worst of curses on that damn window if I—" He yawned and turned onto his other side. Harry pulled his head back. "Had my wand." Harry held back a laugh, knowing the sound would wake Malfoy completely, and hopped back a step on the bedside table. He looked at the back of Malfoy's head. His hair was tousled and still glowing, and Harry wondered about a strange, exciting and slightly tingling pulling inside him. It felt like Malfoy was his next adventure. To be honest, this should be the end now, but it feels a bit like it's too open. I like open endings, but I don't know if there isn't something missing here. What do you think? Curtains closed or a little preview?